Great, welcome back to the Why Social Enterprise Summit. I'm really, really pleased to have Rachel Oliver from Positive Money join us today. Welcome, Rachel.
Hello.
For those of you that are watching live or have been watching the replays and watching this on the replay, then thank you so much for signing up. We've still got, I think, another 5 guest speakers joining us later in the week. And you can watch all the past episodes that we've had over the last week or so as well, which you'll get emails about that link. So check your emails for the link of the replays if you haven't watched the replays yet. Today we're going to be talking to Rachel about what money is, where does it come from, and why does it matter? Which I think is a really interesting topic, particularly since we've been talking a lot about money, finance and economics around social enterprises over the last couple of days. So I think this is just going to add to that great discussion that we've already had with various panelists. So Rachel, I'm going to let you start and actually just introduce yourself, your role and what Positive Money does, and then we'll get into your presentation and discussion as well.
Sure. So my name's Rachel Oliver. I'm the head of campaigns and organising at Positive Money, which means I'm in charge of mobilising, connecting and growing our supporter network. We have 4 key programmes of work at Positive Money: research, policy and advocacy, the supporter network, which I manage, and we support an international network as well. So yeah, I think that's probably a good enough introduction, and the presentation will tell you a lot more about why Positive Money exists and our analysis of the problems with the current money and banking system and our solutions.
Brilliant. Okay, fantastic. For those of you that are watching live, you're welcome to ask questions throughout, but we'll kind of come to those at the end. But if you're prompted by a question as we go through, then please do write that in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and I'll make sure that if we've got time, we'll come and ask Rachel those at the end as well. So Rachel, I know you've got a presentation to start, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion after that. So if you want to get that set up, and we'll go straight into that. That'd be brilliant.
Sure. So shall I just start sharing my screen now?
Yeah, that'd be great. Just bear with us because it takes a few moments. There we go. Great, we can see that.
Fantastic. So who makes the money that we have in our hands, in our wallets?
Good question. Well, and this is why I wanted you to come on, because I know when we first met, we were at another conference where you posed this question, it really got me thinking.
Absolutely. So your typical answer to this, I mean, often it's amazing when you ask people this, and myself very much included, I think when I first got answered this question, it's kind of the Bank of England, surely, or yeah, the Bank of England. And that's correct. You can see on the top of that note that the Bank of England creates those, the notes and coins that we know of to be money. What would happen if you made your own money and started to circulate it?
That's interesting.
You'd probably be caught by the police or taken to court. It's illegal to create your own money, of course. So now we have to notice that whilst the Bank of England has the power to create the notes and coins that exist in of what we know to be money, that is actually only approximately 3% of our money supply. So now we come on to the question of who makes electronic money. And this is actually where most of the money that circulates in our economy exists in the modern world, digitally. So that's when we make bank transfers, it's when we get paid our salaries, it's through paying through credit cards and debit cards. Most of the money that actually exists in our economy isn't physical cash and doesn't exist as physical cash anywhere. So the answer to this question is that commercial banks actually have the power to create this money. And they do that in the form of bank deposits when they make new loans. one simple way of thinking about this is that if Kat wanted to borrow £20,000, she might go to the bank and say, hey, I want to borrow £20,000 so I can buy a flat. And they'd say, okay, well, because we've also lent Rachel £20,000, we know we're going to get that money back, so we can lend Kat £20,000. So they then just create that money out of thin air, out of nothing, and make a loan to Kat. So what this means is the vast majority of the money in our economy is made up of debt, money that exists as debt because people owe it back to the banks. So this was actually something that Positive Money pushed for the Bank of England to confirm, which it did in its quarterly bulletin in 2014. Obviously that has a huge readership, but having this evidence was really useful for the Positive Money campaign. So most people think that banks operate in this way. Can I just check that? Can you see the top? Oh, there we go. That's better. Sorry, there's a slight funny thing on my screen. So, as I said, banks create money when they make loans, and most people, again, when you sort of say, how do you think a bank operates? Why do they make loans? They think, well, because my grandma's put loads of savings into the bank, they can lend me some money because they've got money there. So it's actually kind of a rolling pot of money. But that's not how it exists, as we just said. It's not existing money that banks are loaning. So that is not actually how modern banks work. Adair Turner, who was the Financial Services Authority chairman at the time of the financial crash, has confirmed this as well. And he's actually referring to what is a big problem with economics at the moment, and with our whole political and economic understanding and system, is that what most economics undergraduate textbooks say is banks take the deposits from households and lend money to businesses, but that is completely mythological as a description of how an advanced economy works. So this is a problem, that our economics teaching is not teaching the correct form of economics, and a lot of politicians will study PPE. A lot of the people who end up as our kind of leaders of banking institutions will have supposedly studied economics, but that is a problem. So there is an organisation that exists called Rethinking Economics, and they are a student-led organisation who exists to challenge universities and economics departments to teach a pluralist form of economics. We work with them, and in fact I'm going up to see them in a couple of weeks' time. So we have this system. There are two key questions, I think. Where does money come from? And we've established that the vast majority of it comes from commercial private banks when they make loans. And now the next question is, where does that money go, and what impact does that have on our economy? So this is a kind of breakdown of where bank lending goes to. So we see that 39% of it goes to mortgages, 41% of it goes into financial markets, and only 12% goes to non-financial businesses. And that is what we'd think of as traditional, ordinary businesses that operate, shops, things that you'll see on the high street, or things that actually sell people things, as opposed to the financial market, which is where kind of stocks, shares, insurance, pension funds, all that kind of thing exists. So the final bit of that puzzle is credit cards and personal loans. And so what we have is a situation where we think of the economy in two ways. So we have the financial economy and the real economy. And the real economy is where most ordinary people operate. And the financial economy is kind of I like to think of it as like not really a real thing, because there's no stuff involved in that. There's not many jobs, there's not many things produced. It's not actually getting money circulating to lots of people, but it's simply a lot of money circulating around to a very few number of people who operate in that world. Let me just show us how this creates problems. So as you see on the previous slide, 39% of money created by banks goes into mortgages. And a big reason why that is a problem is because that is money going to property that already exists. So what that does is actually inflate the amount of money that's in a mortgage and is benefit to the bank and to asset owners, but it's not actually creating any new homes, and it's not creating any new jobs along with that. And so what you get is this situation where banks are essentially just really reinforcing inequality and worsening inequality through this whole process. If you think about the kind of injustice of the fact that most people have gone to a bank who created money out of nothing, charged interest on that money, and they essentially were getting homes that are older, more decrepit, smaller, and we are paying more and more money and debt and interest on those homes. This really disadvantages young people and people who can't afford to buy property in the first place. So it creates a housing crisis, creates huge household debt. The reason, as I said, up to 97% of the money in our economy is actually debt. So this is why we have such a high debt economy. It creates huge inequality, particularly generational and geographical inequality. And it's also contributing to climate change because of the vast majority of the kind of big companies that operate in the financial market will be contributing to climate change, and the banks have no incentive to lend for the long term. So to lend for companies or organizations that are going to benefit society in the long term, what they are focused on is maximizing their short-term profits, and that means that they will focus where they will get the highest return, so housing, financial markets, climate companies. So we have Adair Turner back again, because he says lots of sensible things, and he's telling us that the financial crisis of 2007 and 8 occurred because we failed to constrain the private financial system's creation of private credit and money. And what that really means is banks were lending and lending and lending, and ultimately that has led to the crisis. So we have a system where people cannot afford anymore to pay back all the debt, and people are kind of enslaved to this system, if you like. There's no real way out of it. So quantitative easing, this is a very exciting term. I always part of the reason I do my job is because I like to try and make things more accessible, and so I often laugh at the kind of inaccessibility of all of the things in economics, but we mustn't let them put us off getting involved, because we all know that the system is really messed up. Anyway, so quantitative easing, what is this? This is one way in which the Bank of England can create money, essentially. And the idea of quantitative easing is that it injects money into the economy in times of need. So after the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, we saw the Bank of England create £375 billion of money to try and stimulate the economy. And again, after the Brexit vote, they created £70 billion more of quantitative easing. So what this, the way this currently works is that the Bank of England will inject money into the financial economy, And the actual process that it does this through is by buying bonds, government bonds, off of companies, in the hope that they basically will then have some more money to get lending again. And the hope is that this money will trickle down into the real economy and help stimulate the real economy. But because of everything we've just covered, we can see that that actually just reinforces the same old problems that the current bank lending and bank creation of money process creates. So, after, as I said, after the financial crash, we saw billions of pounds being created by the biggest central banks around the world. As I said, since 2009, the Bank of England has created £440 billion of new money. And let's just contrast that with the fact that the narrative that was dominating our media and political landscape at that time was, we've overspent, we've run out of money, so we all need to tighten our belts and we're going to inflict austerity on society. Meanwhile, the Bank of England was essentially handing billions, hundreds of billions of pounds of money to the richest companies in the world, and that was going towards making the top richest decile of society a lot richer. So, as I said and implied, this isn't very effective for getting money going around the real economy. So every pound of QE quantitative easing has added just 8 pence to the UK economy, according to Positive Money research. And as I said, QE doesn't benefit everyone equally. So, as I said, it reinforces the bank's way of giving money to better off people. And you'll just see this is the actual distribution of what QE is contributed towards. And we saw Mark Carney using a really convoluted explanation of, he said that the poorest had actually relatively gained more, but that is because they are so much poorer in the first place that relatively they have. That if you look at the absolute figures, it's quite shocking that essentially our central bank has handed £300,000 to the richest 20% of households. That number increases significantly again when we look at the top 5%, while very, very little has gone to the rest of us, and we've been operating under austerity politics. So our politicians don't seem to understand this, how our system really works. And what we saw quite a lot, particularly in the 2016 general election campaign, was politicians saying there is no magic money tree. 2017 election campaign, we saw Amber Rudd use it, we saw Theresa May use it, and before that we've seen Nick Clegg use it and David Cameron himself. And we actually, sorry, I thought I was going to play the video. We made a video about this which exposed the Prime Minister saying there is no magic money tree to a nurse, and when in fact we know that there is. And there are two, you could argue, because there is the Bank of England and there are commercial banks. And arguably, this is just kind of very much our politicians either not understanding, which is what I would is kind of what I think is the main reason, or lying to people about where money really comes from, because where does money come from in the first place? And we often see politicians using the analogy of the UK, the economy that we have in the UK, the country's economy is like a household budget. But of course, it's nothing like a household budget, because we don't have in our household the ability to create money and decide where that is allocated and pumped into the economy. Whereas in the way an economy functions, we do have that. There actually has to be a money supply, and how that money comes about and where it's created has huge consequences, as we can see. So what if I told you that, well, yes, sorry, I'm slightly getting ahead of myself with this presentation. 85% of MPs don't know where money comes from, and Positive Money commissioned a professional poll of MPs in 2014 and then again in 2017, and we saw that if you look at that, the ninth man in that line would have just been one more, would have been all in red in 2014. So it's improved slightly in the last few years, but we can still see that there's a huge knowledge gap. Mm-hmm. There's also a problem with the makeup of the major policy committees at the Bank of England, and these are the most powerful. There are two basically most powerful committees at the Bank of England, and they are pretty pale, male, and stale. There are only 6.2% of people in colour in management positions at the Bank of England, and this creates problems for various reasons, but mainly because of narrow thinking we have in our economic institutions. A lot of those people have come straight out of operating in the financial world, in the private sector, and we have very few people from representatives from small and medium businesses or social enterprises, or people representing trade unions, or people who actually have experience of operating in the real economy. And of course, people of colour and women, how on earth are we expected to have their interests kind of met if they aren't represented at all? So this is something else that Positive Money talks about and highlights and campaigns on. Not only is where money comes from a problem and where that money goes, but how all these decisions are being made obviously has an impact on those things. So what do we advocate instead of this pretty broken, unfair, undemocratic and environmentally damaging system? Well, our vision is for a fair, democratic and sustainable money and banking system. So we think house price growth should be restrained. We don't believe austerity is helpful at all. We believe that the public, first and foremost, should have control over new money. We believe we need to fight inequality. It's getting to very dangerous levels in this country. We need to reduce debt, and we need to protect the planet as well. So one way we advocate that we do that, because we have several policy recommendations, but because of the analysis that I've given you so far about QE, we would advocate for QE for people. So this is where, instead of newly created money by the Bank of England going into financial markets, new money would be created to fund society's needs. So one way of doing QE for people is a thing called helicopter money, which is where the central bank and through the government could actually credit every adult in the UK's bank account with a certain amount of money, and that figure would have been £6,834 if it had been if the £440 billion of new money had been distributed evenly amongst the population. And there's more about this on the Positive Money website, where you can read how, when I showed you earlier about the 8 pence of the £1 reaching the real economy, this would actually lead to clearly a lot more of that money getting into the real economy and doing a lot more to stimulate the economy and getting money rolling around the economy, instead of money just literally going straight to the top and very little going into the real economy. The other way of doing QE is that new money could be created by the Bank of England and go towards the building of schools or hospitals, or simply to fund more nurses and more teachers. It could go into a clean energy programme. And that would actually create jobs. It would create infrastructure that our society needs, and it would also contribute to the shift towards the green economy. And arguably, the Bank of England should be taking a really leading role in that. So we have various policy and research documents on that on our website. So this is how that could work kind of visually. The Bank of England creates that new money and it is spent by the government. It's up to the government where that money gets spent, as it rightly should be. But the Bank of England, who are, you know, the experts supposedly in deciding how much money is needed at any one time in the economy, should be up to an independent committee to decide how much money is that needed, and then to the government to decide how that is spent, what the society needs at the time. So a few more of our policy proposals. As I touched on there, we're doing a lot of work about how the Bank of England should be leading the way towards the low carbon economy. We're also doing a lot of stuff about digital cash and protecting physical cash as well. Access to cash is a really important thing. And one way of us moving towards a system where the commercial banks have less power over creating money would be to allow the Bank of England to create a digital form of cash. And if you think right back to the start of this presentation, when I kind of zoom out of everything, that is what makes most sense to me. You know, if the Bank of England should be the only body that is able to create the cash that we rely on, then it should be creating the digital cash as well. And what this would also do would mean that we don't have to rely on private companies and card companies to make our payments. Currently, the payment system is not that stable because if a few companies went under or have problems, we'd suddenly lose our main means of making payment through cards, whereas if it was created by the Bank of England, and one proposal is even to allow citizens to hold bank accounts directly at the Bank of England, then we wouldn't be relying on banks to create money, to make our payments. Finally, RBS is a campaign we're working on at the moment. As our director, Positive Money, has said here, the sell-off of RBS is a colossal wasted opportunity. RBS is currently majority owned by the taxpayer, but George Osborne started a process of selling off the bank bit by bit over the course of the next few years. But we argue that this will both lose the taxpayer billions of pounds, but it's also a lost opportunity, because what the government could do is break up RBS and break it up into regional banks that have a remit to support the local and the real economy. So it's actually, RBS could be, the government could choose to restructure RBS and to make it the start of restructuring our whole banking landscape, and make sure that we have a much healthier ecosystem of banks operating, instead of us relying on a few big banks who are currently behaving in reckless ways and not serving the real economy. So this is where we kind of get into the nuts and bolts of how Positive Money operates. As I said at the start of the call, we have 4 main programs of work. We do research, we write books and papers and blogs, and we present those, and we meet with other economists, do roundtables and that kind of thing. We have a fantastic supporter network, which includes 30 local groups around the country and 70,000 online followers. We also have a media operation. So in the last year, Positive Money, in particular in the last year, Positive Money has been a much more present voice in the media. You can see Fran Boyt at the bottom left there on Sky News, and my colleague David on BBC News. We've been on Sky and BBC quite regularly actually in the course of the last 6 months, which has been fantastic for getting the message out there. And we do all of this in order to influence people in power. So again, there you can see Fran alongside Ed Balls and Martin Wolf, who's the chief financial commentator at the Financial Times. And we launch our papers often at events in Parliament alongside panels of MPs. So we also support an international movement. We recently set up Positive Money Europe, so have a small team operating from Brussels. We founded the International Movement for Monetary Reform, so that's kind of linking up all of the positive monies around the world. And one of the things that they do is have an annual conference, as you can see in the picture there. And exists to kind of spread learning and support joint efforts amongst our organisations. So as we always say at the end of our presentations, if any of this has interested you, please have a look at the local groups page on our website. Make sure you are signed up to our newsletter. I promise not to email you more than roughly once every 2 weeks, but you can see what we're doing and you can add your voice or make a donation. And you're always very welcome to come to our campaign actions as well. We have a fantastic, friendly supporter network and always love to have more people on board. So just want to leave us with that positive note. Positive money's always positive. We recognise that the changes we're seeking to make are big changes, they're systemic changes, they're radical, but we think that the challenges we're faced with in society today are extreme and urgent, and so we need radical new ways of thinking, and we believe that reforming the economic system is fundamental to us bringing down inequality, stopping climate change, and kind of restoring the cohesiveness of our democracies around the world.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Rachel. That's been brilliant. If you want to, we'll share all those links and some of the reports that you've mentioned as well in the resource that we're sharing after the whole summit, with everybody's sort of links and comments and reports and research and books that they've recommended and stuff. So thanks for that. If you can close that down so we can see ourselves a bit bigger, not that I'd like to see myself, but I know it's better for other people, and also the recording. Excuse me. That was really, really helpful and really informative, I think, in terms of it certainly helps me understand a little bit more about money, because I certainly know very, very little. And I'm sure lots of people on the summit will find that really useful. I've got quite a few questions, if that's okay. From
sure.
it.
I'll do my best to answer them.
So I think what's really helpful, and actually what really surprises me, is, like you said, that dominance that exists of not real money in the financial sector, or actually the majority, or only 3% of money actually being, cash in the real economy. But we'll come back to some of that. But I'm interested in terms of, because your ideas I'm absolutely supportive of, but are quite radical, what kind of response do you get from the Bank of England and government currently, or MPs even?
That's a really good question, and it's quite a mixed answer. There are some really forward-thinking people at the Bank of England and MPs. We do have MPs from across the political spectrum who support us. So one of our biggest, earliest advocates was an MP called Steve Baker, who's a Conservative politician and who sat on the influential Treasury Select Committee. So the Treasury Select Committee is important because it's the most powerful group of MPs when it comes to the money and banking system. It's their job to monitor, scrutinise, question the Bank of England's policy. So that's a group of MPs that Positive Money engages with quite a lot. And the Green Party have fully endorsed Positive Money's proposals, and indeed they are part of their manifesto. The Labour Party, it's quite a mixture. We had John McDonnell speak at an event we organised in September to mark the 10 years since the economic crash. He spoke at a rally outside the Bank of England, which was very positive. They Jeremy Corbyn, actually, one of his kind of key proposals in his, I think it must be the 2015 leadership election, was QE for people. Which is obviously something that Positive Money advocates. It's not currently on the Labour manifesto. What they advocate for currently instead is an investment bank, a national investment bank, which is something Positive Money would support, which is good. But we do believe that we should have more radical changes, and I think so. Whilst they are radical, what we need to bear in mind is that the way the Bank of England has been operating, or the policies that the Bank of England has championed over the last 10 years, have also been pretty radical and quite unheard of before then. The extremely low interest rates and quantitative easing are two pretty... I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but they are policies that the Bank of England hadn't engaged with very much before, and interest rates are still really, really low, and they have never restored back to their kind of pre-crisis levels. And so the Bank of England is kind of out of tools in its toolbox, if you like. And so one thing that Positive Money is a real strength about our campaign is that we're actually here offering solutions. And at times of uncertainty, which we certainly feel like we're in at the moment, is often when kind of new ideas can flourish and gain in popularity. And we have a lot of economists, like, for example, Martin Wolf, and Adair Turner, who agree with what Positive Money is saying, and we're seeing an increasing number of economists coming out and saying what Positive Money is saying is important, and we should be looking at new tools, for example, QE for people, and digital cash. We saw the head of the IMF come out and say quite favourable things about, encouraging things about the prospect of central banks issuing a digital currency in the last week. And I think hopefully that's kind of answered your question. But kind of one thing we're really keen to do, and one thing our supporters really want us to do, is when we're looking into, is trying to find a way that we can reach more MPs and educate them about how the system works, because, as I said in the presentation, that is a big part of the problem, that there's just a lack of understanding of how our system works, and that is a problem. So there are various ways that we're tackling it, but I feel very hopeful that in the next few years we could see some changes towards Positive Money's proposals, because we're at that point where they've run out of tools and the economy is going to suffer some shocks, and they're going to have to think of new ways to do things. So
yeah, no, definitely, that's really helpful. And I think to me it sounds like, I think some of the stuff you were sort of suggesting as well, that there's quite a lot of, there appears to be, and I'm cynical about this stuff, but there appears to be quite a lot of spin because of, and they're able to maximise on that because of the lack of knowledge in the general populace, including MPs, who at the end of the day are generally not economists and are normal, are also just members of the public in many respects, who have that lack of knowledge to be able to challenge or kind of unpack sometimes some of that, public spin around where money comes from. Like, for example, there not being a money tree when actually money is just pumped into the economy, albeit not in the best areas necessarily. What was interesting to me when you were saying like that £445 billion is put into the financial market, and only 8%, 8p of every pound actually trickles down into the real economy. And the comparison that you said is if we split that out equally amongst the general population, particularly for those, for a significant proportion of the population, 6.5 grand input is going to be a huge amount of money. Particularly for low earners, for young people, for people receiving benefits and on the margins of society, it's really, really going to be quite powerful. And I can see how that potentially, and obviously people would have the choice of not spending it and saving it, but could also potentially really stimulate a market in retail, etc., which obviously is what part of that kind of thing. What is the resistance in terms of thinking about those alternative models? Is it, there's obviously politics with a small p within that, or is it the cynic? Because the cynic within me, it completely reiterates sort of your thoughts around actually it's just helping the wealthy and the biggest business owners and biggest businesses to get wealthier.
Yeah, I think that there might be an element of that, but I always remember a training I did with a lady called Kirsty McNeil, who she was an advisor to Gordon Brown, and she works in the NGO and charity sector as well, and she kind of, her training was all about how you influence MPs and how you can convince them of your ideas, and she gave a lot of insights into kind of how politicians work. And she said at the start of her presentation, the minute you've decided that the people you're up against are evil, you've lost.
Yeah.
Because they're not actually, and the vast majority of them genuinely believe that what they are doing is the right thing to do, by society, by the way the economy works. And so you have to win the argument rather than kind of focusing on just brandishing them as evil. It doesn't work, and it's also quite disempowering, I think, for people if they just kind of think, oh, we're just inevitably, these people are going to always try and extract the most profit for themselves. And I would point you towards a really useful piece of work that's been done by a few different organisations, but the New Economics Foundation and New Economy Organisers Network, which is called what's it called? Sorry. Framing the Economy. And it's basically it's a booklet, and you can access it online, but it basically did a lot of research into how people think and talk about the economy, how ordinary people do, and what are some frames and language that we can start to use to help people rethink how the economy works in a way that it is actually truthful. Because I think one of the problems is simply a kind of a narrow discussion that happens, and there are lots of things that get kind of I guess myths or kind of white lies or pieces of information that aren't fully correct that get kind of thrown around and that scare people. So, oh, what about inflation? Or, oh, you can't simply give people money. That just seems too good to be true, I think, for people in some ways. It just doesn't seem like it could be possible. And yet, actually, what we're doing is handing that money to the kind of wealthiest, but because they're kind of sat behind a company or financial markets, it's a bit easier. But I think the main barrier is the kind of narrow understanding of how an economy works and how an economy can work. And most of our kind of current political elite come from the generation of thinkers that believe that the neoliberal free market system is the way, and that the kind of we should just surrender everything to the market and leave it up to the market. And so for them it makes total sense that you would hand banks money, and leave it up to them, as opposed to handing people money. So we really have to challenge ideas on all sorts of different levels. Like I said, economics teaching, but also we have to keep putting our ideas out there, and positive money, in the time it's been operating, has kind of brought these ideas from being very fringe ideas to being actual ideas that are being discussed about in the mainstream media. And that is a huge kind of win, and shows you how far we've come, but also kind of the current context that we're operating in is allowing that to happen, because people are looking around themselves for ideas, and increasingly we can see that things aren't working the way they're currently going.
Yeah, and I also suppose, you know, the evidence, the research that you've done really backs up the arguments that you have, and it helps you have those arguments much more powerfully than, you know, just, I suppose, having a philosophy of how, you know, and a sort of an idea of how it could be. That you're, like you said, you've actually got solutions based on some of the evidence of how things are currently working for the best, and aren't getting the results that maybe they predicted, or, you know, and exploring alternatives, which I think is really important. And to completely take your point about the success of the campaign and the need to not just create this like us and them, but actually, you know, engage and understand that, you know, people that have different perspectives are often just have different worldviews and kind of different experiences. And, you know, economists will have come through a particular school of thought and experience, and maybe don't get the opportunity to think outside of, you know, alternatives, because they're stuck in what they're doing every day. Which I'm interested, I don't know whether you know of this, but whether there are some of the models, the alternative models that you've been suggesting, do they exist anywhere else currently around the world? Are there other types of markets that operate in other countries, or where some of those solutions are already being operated?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We kind of the main central banks that operate around the world operate in a similar way to we have in the UK, and as you saw in the presentation, a lot of those central banks are engaged in quantitative easing in the way that the UK central bank did. Ideas are gaining traction in different parts of the world. Sweden, for example, they're always ahead of the game, aren't they?
Nordic countries.
Yeah, but they are looking like the country that are most likely to introduce a form of digital cash, or what you call CBDC, central bank digital currency. So there's a thing called the e-krona that they are experimenting with at the moment. And so they're a really interesting country to keep an eye on for central bank digital currency. In terms of quantitative easing for the people, it's a really good question, one I'm going to take to the team, because I don't know the answer. But what I do know is that so the way quantitative easing works is similar to the way that a citizen's dividend could work. So that's where everybody gets a kind of flat level of an amount of money that they just are given for free, and that's an idea that's been experimented with and actually run out. They've experimented with this in communities around the world, and it has been shown to be really effective. So it's very much possible. The Swiss had a referendum recently on whether we should move to a sovereign money system, and so that is a kind of big overall change where we take the power away from commercial banks to create money and instill it in the central bank, and so that money is created free of debt, and so that it's only the public who have the power to create and decide where money is allocated in society. And that there was really, considering the context, was an incredible result, because there was a small team of volunteers running the campaign, and they were up against big banks with big money, who operated a very highly funded campaign against the vote, but 25% of people voted for a sovereign money system, which I think is a really good indication of the fact that people are interested, and for kind of how radical an idea it is compared to the system we currently have. It's quite a big turnout, but it's one of the reasons that Positive Money focuses less on this whole overall system change, which is something we want to see in the long term, but we actually focus on the kind of more specific policies that we will get us there, and which are more in the consciousness and more have more potential to happen in the nearer future. So QE for people, for example, central bank digital currencies, these are stepping stones on the way to this overall system change.
Brilliant. Oh, that's really interesting. Can you, because maybe I misunderstood a little bit, but can you explain the digital currency, the digital cash? Like, how does that work that's different to ordinary cash? Because I didn't quite understand that, and it may just be my naivety. Sorry.
So essentially, a digital cash issued by a central bank wouldn't operate differently from physical cash, in the sense that it is a means of payment, and it is money that doesn't have a debt attached to it, and isn't dependent on a private institution to lend us that money. And it is a kind of 100% guaranteed money, if you like, that is yours. So one of the reasons that some people like to only have cash is because it's actually theirs. No one can take it away from them. Whereas the money in your bank account, a lot of people don't know, actually doesn't belong to you. It's actually the bank's money. And so it's a much safer, more democratic means of payment than money that banks lend and create out of thin air as debt. A central bank digital cash is actually kind of real and owned by the people.
Yeah. No, that's really, really helpful. That makes a lot more sense. And I think that's, it's again, isn't it, that those things around, we forget that the money in the banks isn't our money necessarily, and that but increasingly we're encouraged to have less and less cash because everything is becoming digital. So we're encouraged to have, well, not encouraged, but I mean, we are able to pay by phones, we're able to pay, increasingly by credit and debit cards. Increasingly places don't allow you to pay by cash. And somebody was telling me this weekend they'd been away somewhere, and there just wasn't really, it was almost a cashless society. There wasn't anywhere where you could use cash. And actually I can see the risks for the most vulnerable in society, who can't access bank accounts, who can't, for all sorts of different reasons. That really excludes them from the economy and excludes them from participating.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen, again, there's quite a lot on the Positive Money website about this, but there's cash machines are disappearing at a rate faster than ever seen before. And our politicians could step in and change this. But the big card companies are driving this change because it's in their interest for us to use card. I mean, we genuinely are being encouraged and pressured to move towards not using cash. I see big adverts everywhere from Halifax telling me, why contactless is so great. And yes, you've got rural communities who don't have any access to cash. You think it really doesn't help very small businesses who operate on paying their staff in terms of cash, or if you want to pay a babysitter in terms of cash, or it's also for those people who really don't want our data going to big companies. They can see what we're spending all our money on. And also for small businesses, they have to actually pay card companies in order to use card payments in their shops, and that is a huge problem. I know a lot of people will probably know that, you know, certain kind of corner stores you can only pay by card if you pay over a certain amount, and that's because it's actually costing the shop money to receive payment. And if you think about that, that's kind of just bonkers. Why on earth should they be paying to have to, you know, for the to be able to take payment? And I think it is very easy for card companies to say, hey, this is the way, you know, it's digital, woohoo. But there's problems that come underneath that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I can see how that's sort of we're very close to time, but there's a couple of more things I wanted to discuss, and it's really, really, you know, coming back to the kind of whole thing of social enterprise. For lots of new social enterprises, all those issues you've talked about small businesses, you know, cash can be essential, but also on the other side, in terms of community need, particularly small rural communities, you know, that lack of cash or lack of access to money, or lack of, you know, ownership of that money is really, really challenging, isn't it? And we can see, I know certainly in certain parts, I think in Bristol and Brixton in London, and probably other parts of the UK, they've created their own sort of cash currencies to try and keep wealth within the community in some small part. And, you know, all the shops and local retailers have come on board to support that local economy and probably to resolve some of those particular issues. One of the questions then, I think probably one of the final questions, and if anybody's watching live, please do post your questions in the chat box, and we'll try and just squeeze those in towards the end with Rachel. But I'm interested to know, Rachel, whether, like, kind of what ways are you seeing, if at all, sort of social enterprises shift the way they think about money? Because some of these challenges I can see could play out quite significantly for social enterprises in all sorts of different ways. For example, when I was at the Social Enterprise World Forum earlier this year, and we've talked about this with other guests on the summit as well, is that one of the challenges for social enterprises is investment, and the scale at which particularly small social enterprises think about the risks to do with investment. Because most, you know, successful startups who get significant amounts of investment quickly are getting a lot of income in very quickly. And so one of the challenges to the sector was thinking about, how do we get access to finance much more quickly? And I can see in terms of lots of the operational issues of that, if you're operating in the real economy like you described it, you know, and not even aware or knowledgeable enough or thinking about the financial economy or sector, how you bridge that gap and how we're able to utilize some of that wealth into the social enterprise sector. That makes sense as a question.
Yeah, sort of. I guess I'm hearing it as kind of like, you know, how can social enterprises access finance quicker, and how can social enterprises also support a transition to a system which is more beneficial for everybody. And Positive Money thinks that social enterprises are great, and we would love to have banks that are much more ready to lend to social enterprises. Mm-hmm. And so I think one thing in terms of a kind of campaigning or lobbying aspect that would be really useful for social enterprises, or, you know, the kind of the bodies that represent you be advocating for, is that conditions be put on banks that they are forced to actually lend to social enterprises. Mm-hmm. And that they should be given quotas, for example, for the amount that they are lending to. Because we, and secondary to that, we actually think we need, as I've alluded to, different banks, not just having a few big banks that dominate the market, but we'd much rather have a kind of much healthier ecosystem of different sized banks that are existing to finance things such as social enterprises and local economies, and, you know, that can actually have direct relationships with owners of social enterprises. So again, we would encourage social enterprises to support the types of banks that will support them. Yeah. If that makes sense. And it feels like quite an exciting kind of new a new economy, for example, or a way to help the public and politicians and, you know, all sorts of people who are pro-business to get behind a new way of doing things. So that means new types of banks and new types of businesses working together. So I think that that is a kind of is a real opportunity, if that makes sense, and a way that's kind of more empowering, because absolutely social enterprises are exactly the type of businesses who should be getting the finance they need, so that they can start having a positive impact. And
yeah, and certainly in terms of those you know, the issues around climate change that you're talking about, having that contribution as well as the social benefits and impact as well that social enterprises have. Rachel, it's been fascinating to talk to you. I could literally talk to you for another hour because I've got so many questions.
I still have so many questions on this stuff as well. It's a lot.
Well, I'll maybe send them to you and we can carry on the conversation offline. But I really, really appreciate you sharing just your insights and helping us understand a little bit more about money, where it comes from, who holds that wealth, and particularly, I think, really importantly, the things that you're doing to help people and organisations campaign for an alternative system. So we'll definitely be sharing all your links and the resources and the resources that you've actually mentioned as well. The last question then that I've asked most of the guests on the summit is, what really excites you or brings hope for you in terms of the way all of these things, not just social enterprises, but all of these changes that the likes of you and others who we've had on the summit are talking about in terms of changing the economy, society, and the, you know, our environment for the better, for a sustainable future? What kind of indicators have you got for believing in that hope?
I think for me, it's the fact that if I think back to kind of 10 years ago, and partly it was because I wasn't kind of involved in stuff as much, but I think there are so many more positive initiatives, ideas out there than there were 10 years ago. And I also think that the people creating those, putting those ideas out there, are better connected and skilled than they ever have been. And so that provides me with a lot of hope, because I think that I think if you think about change as like a wave, we are building a really solid surfboard, which is full of ideas and people who are pushing for those changes to happen. And we are also trying to create a wave that we can ride on to bring home those changes. And not all of that is in our power, but we are seeing huge political climate instability. And my hope is that through some of that instability and kind of frightening potential scenarios will come a big wave which will allow us to push through some of the really important structural changes that we need in our society. So I feel like we're building a really strong surfboard.
Yeah, brilliant. No, that's really great. Thank you. And thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you sharing all your thoughts and insights. That's been really brilliant.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
No, it's been fantastic. And hopefully speak to you soon.
Yes. Thanks so much, Kat.
You're welcome. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.